If you're enjoying this kind of content, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. It really helps the algorithm. Eli stepped out of the old pickup, a utilitarian vehicle, and the air struck him like a cold, wet towel. It was deep North Country air, heavy with the perpetual scent of damp pine needles and the distant, unseen generator, a diesel beat that sounded like the weary heart of the facility. He had driven 500 miles, trading one kind of suffocating dread for another. Here, the dread wore camouflage, blending into the severe geometry of the surrounding fir forest. The structure before him, Sector 7, was unimpressive. It was a collection of squat prefab concrete boxes, stained gray and green by years of condensation and neglect, sunk deep into the earth as if ashamed of its own existence. The windows were small, high slits, protected by heavy mesh that made the place look less like a research facility and more like a poorly maintained prison for something very dangerous. A man waited for him at the single steel door. This was Glenn. Glenn's face was a map of neglect, a piece of waxed paper crumpled, rain-soaked, and smoothed out without success. His handshake was dry, brittle, like grasping a bundle of sticks. Eli registered the smell immediately. Cheap tobacco, the kind that burns too hot, and a faint, clinical whiff of antiseptic, fighting a losing battle against the rank earthiness of the woods. Eli, glad you could make it before dark, Glenn said. His voice was flat, without inflection, the practiced monotone of bureaucracy. His eyes did not look at Eli's face. They settled about midway down his chest, studying the texture of Eli's faded flannel shirt, finding the man beneath the fabric unworthy of direct scrutiny. The interior of the main block offered no relief from the grim exterior. It was a study in institutional monochrome. The lights were sickly, humming fluorescent tubes that cast a pallid green-tinged illumination, giving Eli's skin a jaundiced cast. Their shoes squeaked on the scuffed linoleum floor, a high, irritating sound. The core sound of the place, however, was that steady, subterranean thrum of the diesel generator, a sound Eli immediately recognized as the lullaby of paranoia. Glenn slid a heavy ring of brass keys across a chipped laminate countertop. They made a solid metallic thunk. Alongside them was a plastic access card, its edges rubbed smooth, almost translucent in spots, handled by generations of nervous fingers. Standard operating procedures are printed on the back of the card, Glenn recited, his gaze fixed on Eli's collarbone. You are the third shift. Main duties: maintenance and feeding. You do not ask questions. You do not bring personal devices into the confinement area. You log every incident, no matter how small. Feed time is 10 o'clock post-meridium sharp. You use the service corridor. Keep the perimeter light off when approaching the gate. And under no circumstances, Eli, do you try to look for it. The shadows are the shadows' business. The instructions arrived with the banal efficiency of a corporate checklist. There was no theatrical menace, no whispered warnings about eldritch horrors, just the tedious regulation of a slaughterhouse shift. This lack of drama, Eli realized, made the whole thing profoundly more unsettling. It suggested that whatever was kept here had been normalized, reduced to a line item in a quarterly budget. Glenn led him down a narrow hallway to his quarters. The room was small, 12 feet by 10 feet, smelling of trapped dust and oxidized metal. The window overlooked a dense wall of black pines, already fading into an impenetrable mass as the dusk deepened. The furniture was military surplus: a cot with a thin mattress, a steel locker, and a rickety writing table. It was the windowsill that caught Eli's attention. Lined up with meticulous, cold precision were a row of dead houseflies. They were perfectly intact, their dry, brittle bodies arranged strictly by size. The smallest, no bigger than a peppercorn, started on the left, scaling up to a fat bluebottle specimen on the right. It was a tiny, desiccated gradient, an exercise in morbid symmetry. Eli stared at the little insect graveyard, a tight knot forming in his stomach. This was not the signature of negligence. It was the chilling hallmark of an obsessive, systematic mind, a small piece of architecture in the heart of the ordinary. Glenn did not notice, or chose not to comment. Your key code is 4719. Do not share it. Do not lose those keys. They are heavy for a reason. With that, Glenn left, his shoes scratching quickly on the linoleum, the sound dying abruptly around the corner. Eli stood in the silence. It was not the peaceable quiet found deep in the woods. This was a pressurized silence, thick and absorbent, like sonic foam. It muffled everything, even the hum of the fluorescent tube directly above his head, turning its buzz into a low underwater throb. He felt the absence of sound pushing against his eardrums, an almost physical weight. He sat on the edge of the cot. He still smelled the city on his jacket. Stale coffee, gasoline vapor, the faint, comforting musk of millions of people living complicated, rational lives. But here, that life felt remote, a fiction viewed through a distant telescope. That world, with its traffic lights and mortgages, and its belief in measurable reality, was dissolving minute by minute into this immovable, watchful darkness outside the window. Eli felt his shoulders tighten. He ran a hand over his jaw, feeling the stubble. He was here because he needed money, because the bills were stacked too high. Now he was paid to exist in the deep woods and feed something they would not let him look at. He found a perverse comfort in the sheer, unforgiving routine. It was simple and terrifying. He got up, locked the door with one of the heavy brass keys. It turned with a satisfying ancient groan, and checked his watch. It was 8:15 post-meridium, 2 hours until the first feeding. He walked to the window and pressed his face close to the cool glass, trying to penetrate the blackness of the tree line. He saw nothing, but he felt watched, analyzed, catalogued, just like the dead flies on the sill. The temperature outside dropped significantly, chilling the air to the high 30s Fahrenheit, prickling the back of his neck. He settled into the weight of the silence, listening for the shift in the generator's rhythm. He waited for the first sign that the cold mechanics of this place were merely a shell around something truly awful. He knew the base was meant to keep the hidden things contained. The night had only just begun to settle its weight upon Sector 7. The hour of 10 o'clock post-meridium arrived like a blow to the back of the neck. Eli had spent the intervening time attempting to unpack, a futile exercise that mostly involved moving canned beans from one dusty surface to another. When the cheap alarm clock, a digital unit Glenn had provided that glowed with an aggressive red light, finally flashed the mandated time, Eli felt a sudden, profound lurch of adrenaline. He collected the cleaning implements and then located the service elevator, a cage of distressed steel that smelled strongly of hydraulic fluid and mildew. He pressed the button labeled B3. The descent was slow and labored, the cable whining high overhead. B3 was a cold, subterranean world. The temperature here held at 45 degrees Fahrenheit, humid and bone-chilling. The walls were weeping concrete, thick with condensation that gathered into rivulets and tracked down into greasy puddles on the floor. It felt like the cold sweat of the building itself, nervous about what it contained. The air was heavy, viscous, thick with a fine, oily mist that held the light captive. Fluorescent tubes struggled to pierce the gloom, their light sickly yellow as it filtered through the airborne particulates. Along the ceiling, a network of rusty pipes ran, thick as a man's torso. As Eli walked, the pipes occasionally shuddered violently, releasing a deep, bronchial rumble, an unsettling sound suggesting the concrete structure was trying and failing to clear its throat. The feeding station was at the end of a long, claustrophobic corridor. Eli found the heavy transport cart parked against the wall. He threw back the canvas tarp. Inside were the rations. The rations were not neat cuts. They were rough slabs of raw meat, dense layers of muscle and white connective tissue, laced with thick, yellowing fat. The size of the cuts suggested a massive animal, perhaps cattle, but the packaging was careless, crude. The meat was still slightly warm, giving off a humid, thick, almost sweet scent that clashed violently with the antiseptic smell Eli had picked up from Glenn. It was the rich, overwhelming steam of fresh butchery. Eli's fingers were clammy against the cold metal handle of the cart. He hated the way the smell of the meat instantly clung to him, saturating the fibers of his clothes, burrowing into his sinuses. He wheeled the cart toward the containment door. The door was formidable, a construction of reinforced steel 10 inches thick, secured with 3 rotating wheel locks. Set into the lower third of the door was the transfer mechanism, a large stainless steel tray or chute designed to slide in and out. Above it at eye level was the viewing port, a narrow, foot-long slit protected by thick, cloudy laminated glass. Eli worked quickly, fighting the nausea rising in his throat. He transferred the heavy, slick slabs of meat from the cart into the chute. The work was messy, and the heat radiating from the fresh kill was intense. The aroma turned cloying, like rotting flowers dipped in copper. He shoved the last piece, a slab that weighed 30 pounds, into the tray, sliding the chute home with a rough metallic clang. He then stepped back, wiping his greasy hands on his pants. The moment the tray locked into place, the overwhelming silence of the confinement area on the other side dissolved. It was not a growl or a snarl. Instead, a soft, wet sound began, unlike anything Eli had ever associated with consumption. It was a liquid, intimate slopping, a gentle, repetitive churning, like someone rolling a heavy, waterlogged fruit around inside their mouth. It was methodical processing, devoid of hungry violence. The lack of aggression made it worse. Eli stood there frozen, listening to the impossible sounds of something large dealing with meat. He could not place the sound in the animal kingdom. It suggested immense power utilized with unsettling restraint. Then the sense of being watched arrived, not as a suspicion, but as a physical intrusion. It came not from the narrow viewing slit, but radiated through the concrete, through the soles of his work boots, up into his chest. This gaze was cold, alien, and utterly analytical, devoid of passion or malice. It was the look a scientist gives a petri dish, a gaze meant only to dissect and understand utility. The air in the corridor solidified around Eli. It suddenly took on a distinct, unmistakable flavor, heavy and pungent, the taste of copper, of pennies, the metallic tang that rushes into the mouth after a sharp blow. It was the taste of shed human blood, ancient, baked into the very atmosphere of the facility. Eli stumbled back a step, catching himself on the damp wall. He wanted desperately to look into the viewing port, to put a face or a form to the hunger and the intelligence he felt pressing against him. But Glenn's instruction, "Don't try to look for it," held him paralyzed. He knew, deep in the primitive wiring of his brain, that whatever was looking back would not just be seen. It would look through him, and then it would know everything that held him together. The wet sounds of consumption continued for perhaps 90 seconds, and then, as abruptly as it began, the silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. The metallic taste lingered on Eli's tongue. He pulled the empty chute back out. It was wiped clean, meticulously. Not a smear of fat, not a fragment of bone. Just polished steel, glistening slightly with condensation. Back in his room, Eli spent 20 minutes scrubbing his hands with the industrial-grade grit soap provided, rubbing until the skin on his knuckles was raw and pink. The visual filth was gone, but the ghost of the meat's warmth and the heavy copper scent remained, lodged in the pores of his skin. He lay on his cot, unable to settle, the red glare of the clock mocking him. The generator thrummed its tired rhythm. He tried to focus on his breathing, but his mind kept looping back to the sub-level. He thought about the condensation, the sick yellow light, the taste of blood, and the unnerving, meticulous nature of the feeding. The sound of dripping water started up somewhere down the hall, a relentless drip, drip, drip against metal. Eli stared up at the ceiling, listening. In the oppressive silence of Sector 7, each drop sounded like a heavy, carefully placed footstep, traveling slowly, inexorably, up from the depths of B3, closer and closer to his fragile, locked door. He pulled the thin blanket tight, acutely aware that the silence of the night simply waited for the next scheduled ritual to break the monotony. He felt like he had just attended a terrible communion, and he was covered in the host. A week slid past Eli, lubricated by canned goods and a growing numbness. Time in Sector 7 accumulated, piling up one monotonous gray hour upon the next. His life became an unholy rhythm. Wake, clean the sterile, unused upper corridors, consume lukewarm beans, await 10 o'clock post-meridium, descend, feed the dweller, return, sleep under the relentless thrum of the generator. Eli named the creature the Dweller in his mind, safer than acknowledging it as a prisoner or a charge. The routine was hypnotic, designed to grind down independent thought until the people working here were little more than biological clockwork, synchronized with the diesel rhythm outside. The oddity was the cleanliness. The dweller's chute was always spotless. But after 3 days, Eli noticed small, almost imperceptible changes around the confinement door itself. On the rough concrete floor, just outside the sliding tray, were recurring marks. They were oily, shimmering streaks, sometimes forming delicate branching patterns, like the complex veined filigree found on the wings of nocturnal moths. They disappeared with a pass of the mop, only to reappear the next evening. They felt deliberate, a silent signature left on the threshold. Eli began observing the other guards more closely. Glenn, the manager, and the 2 others who rotated shifts. Coleman, a hulking man carved from granite, and Greg, slight, jumpy, always chewing the inside of his cheek. They were functional yet profoundly vacant. Their communication consisted solely of necessary, clipped phrases. Shift change, log the power draw. check the intake valves. They never spoke of home or weather. Their faces were perpetually slack, their eyes often fixed somewhere beyond, viewing reality through a dull, dirty pane of glass. They moved with a stiff, unnatural economy, like poorly programmed automatons attempting human gait. Eli felt a creeping certainty that whatever they were guarding, they had already become its echo. One afternoon, while tasked with sweeping out the unused, dusty archive room on B1, Eli found something wedged behind a metal storage cabinet. It was a spiral-bound notebook, heavy and water-damaged, its cover faded to the color of old blood. Most of the pages were ripped out, leaving jagged paper teeth. The remaining pages were filled with obsessive notations. They were not words, but columns of figures, stretching endlessly down the page, sometimes broken by dense geometric formulas that meant nothing to Eli. Interspersed with the math were sketches. They were crudely drawn, yet chillingly effective, depicting human eyes. The pupils were not circles. They were perfect, complex, multi-sided polygons, irregular octahedrons, dodecahedrons, staring out from the paper with cold, inhuman geometry. On the last intact page, the writer's frantic scrawl abruptly ceased mid-sentence, the ink blurring heavily as if the pen had been dropped suddenly. It read, "It doesn't eat the meat, it absorbs our expectation." Eli shut the book quickly, the dry paper rasping. He tucked it inside his jumpsuit, the weight of it suddenly feeling enormous. The phrase echoed in his mind, "absorbs our expectation." It was not hungry for flesh. It was hungry for dread. The anxiety Eli felt was now being magnified by an encroaching, malignant silence outside the base. The forest had gone mute. He had not heard a single bird call in 3 days. The wind, steady and cool, no longer rustled the pine needles. The trees stood rigid, their branches motionless, as if they were holding their collective breath. The forest was ossified, paralyzed by the presence of Sector 7. In this profound, unnatural emptiness, Eli became hypersensitive to his own body. He could hear the rush of blood behind his ears, the faint, wet clicking of his own tongue against his teeth. His own heartbeat, normally a quiet internal drummer, now sounded deafeningly loud, a panicked, frantic noise in the overwhelming vacuum. That evening, during the feeding ritual, curiosity finally eroded his self-preservation. After shoving the tray into the darkness, but before the wet sounds began, Eli cautiously raised his eyes to the viewing port. He pressed his face close to the thick, cloudy glass. The light source inside the containment area was minimal, perhaps just a high-powered work lamp focused on the corner. For a long moment, Eli saw only shadow, dense and absolute. Then, a movement. Not a sudden lunge, but a slow, deliberate unveiling. A pale, almost translucent band of skin crossed the bottom edge of the glass. It was followed by the thing that gripped Eli's mind and chilled his blood. A finger. It was extraordinarily long, slender, and unnervingly flexible, segmented with perhaps 4 or 5 visible joints, ending in a polished black nail. The skin was the color of old milk, nearly devoid of pigment. The finger moved with excruciating slowness toward the fresh steel of the chute. It did not scratch or scrape. It simply touched the metal and then began to trace a single, perfect horizontal line across the surface of the tray. The sound this made was not a scrape. It was a thin, high-pitched shiver, like the moment a razor blade touches glass. It vibrated directly in Eli's sinuses, causing an involuntary spasm of revulsion and a dry, choking cough that seized his throat. The finger disappeared back into the darkness. The familiar wet sloshing began immediately. But Eli no longer heard the sound of consumption. He heard the echo of that soundless line being drawn, a meticulous border between his world and theirs. He staggered back, leaning against the cold concrete until the trembling in his legs subsided. The dweller was not hidden. It was observing the etiquette of the cage, waiting for the proper moment to introduce itself, piece by terrifying piece. On the 10th day, the protocol of the mundane officially fractured. The feeding had gone exactly as it had every night. The cold descent, the overwhelming scent of copper and fresh meat, the thick silence, the wet churning sounds of the dweller consuming its meal. But when Eli retracted the empty steel chute, something rested precisely in the center of the polished surface. It was a piece of bone. It was too small to be a rib or a major long bone. Eli recognized it instantly as a human finger phalanx. It was shockingly white, almost pearlescent, and its surface was unnervingly smooth. There were no marks of chewing, no scoring from teeth. It looked as if it had been dissolved or polished by intense pressure until it was an immaculate, terrible jewel. Instinct told Eli to leave it, to report it. But the image of Glenn's cold, dead eyes and the unsettling sight of the multifaceted pupils in the notebook stayed his hand. To report, it meant disruption, meant attention, meant Glenn might finally look at him instead of through him. Eli picked it up. The moment his skin touched the bone, a shock of cold static ran up his arm, settling deep into his chest. It felt less like a fragment of organic matter and more like a dense piece of ceramic or perhaps a piece of intricate, terrifying clockwork. He slid the bone into the zipped pocket of his jumpsuit, feeling the small, hard weight press against his thigh. It was his secret now, his communion. Returning the next night, Eli knew he had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer just the feeder. He was the collaborator. He performed the ritual, but this time, he could not resist. He peered into the slit again, straining to see. The dweller was still invisible in the gloom, but Eli did not need to see it to know it was there. Because this time, the markings were unmistakable. High on the concrete wall inside the chamber, at least 10 feet off the floor, scraped into the hardened surface with unbelievable force, were carved symbols. They were letters, perfectly formed, rendered with the disturbing calligraphy of the precise, long finger he had seen 2 nights prior. They spelled out his name, EL1. It was centered above the meat tray, etched deep enough that white concrete powder had sifted down onto the floor. The terrifying implication was that the dweller did not just know he was there. It knew his designation. It had studied the logs, or simply absorbed the data from the atmosphere. Eli realized with gut-wrenching clarity that he was attending a highly specialized, intensely personal study session. The dweller was an entomologist, and Eli was the prize specimen, regularly supplied with fresh resources, his reactions keenly observed. The foundation of Eli's rational mind began to crumble, giving way to the swampy terrain of pure sensation. The terror was still there, a knot of ice, but it was now laced with a strange, dark reverence. He stopped thinking about escape. He started thinking about proximity. The meat, he suddenly understood, was a currency, a means of exchange, but not the object of desire. It was a distraction, a biological requirement to keep the anchor stable, as Glenn would term it. The real interaction was happening now, in this cold silence, in the exchange of glances and the offering of bones. The next night, Eli brought a gift. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slightly tarnished brass button he had torn off his jacket. Before sliding in the meat, he placed the button right in the center of the chute. The consumption was the same, but when the tray returned, the button was gone. In its place were 3 new fragments of bone arranged in a small, unsettling triangle. These pieces were smaller than the first, almost like the tiny, complicated bones found in the inner ear or the parts of a child's wrist. They were impossibly white, shining under the lamplight. This reciprocal exchange sealed Eli's complicity. He became addicted to the ritual. He brought the dweller a piece of crumpled aluminum foil, a dry leaf, a spent rifle casing he had found out in the woods. Each time, he received fragments in return, pieces of bone that became increasingly abstract, complex, and beautiful. They did not belong to any single terrestrial skeleton. They were the terrifying pieces of a puzzle Eli knew he was meant to assemble, a mosaic of impossible anatomy. His internal monologue devolved into a slow, viscous current of pure sensory data. He no longer processed thoughts like escape or error. Instead, his mind was filled with the exact nuance of the concrete's rough texture against his skin, the precise temperature difference between the steel door and the air, and the overwhelming, heady smell of copper. He felt a profound curiosity about the density of human tissue and how easily it might yield to a certain kind of pressure. The realization settled on him with the weight of a granite slab. The meat was a bribe, a necessary concession to the guard's fragile reality. What the dweller truly craved, and what it was patiently collecting, were tokens of Eli's acknowledgement. The bone fragments were not leftovers. They were keys, small white invitations to something far beyond the realm of hunger and fear. Eli accepted every one of them. He began to sleep with the growing collection of bones tucked beneath his thin pillow, feeling the faint, static cold radiating from them, an anchor of dread in the overwhelming silence. He was no longer guarding the cage. He was tending the collection. The weather turned grim, swallowing the last vestiges of late autumn light. A steady, relentless rain set in, transforming the landscape surrounding Sector 7 into a churning gray mire. The base itself became an island of strained, humming concrete amidst a sloshing, perpetually wet purgatory. Water seeped into everything, mixing with the greasy puddles in the sublevels, and, Eli noted with a sickening realization, often swirling dangerously close to the dweller's chute, taking on a reddish, coppery sheen from the runoff. The air quality worsened dramatically. The perpetual scent of decay, rotting pine, and wet soil now overlaid the metallic tang of the sublevels, creating an overwhelming, sickly sweet flavor that was almost chewable. It was the scent of old death and new growth, fighting for dominance in the tight corridors. The transformation in the guards accelerated. They were not just vacant now, they were deteriorating. Greg, the jittery one, had stopped shaving entirely. The stubble that sprouted on his face was thick, black, and sharp, like rigid metallic wire struggling to push through his waxy gray skin. He moved with a jerky, bird-like quality, constantly tilting his head as if listening to frequencies too high for human hearing. Coleman, always stoic, was now actively disturbing. Eli found him once in a supply closet, seated on an overturned bucket, staring intensely at a bare section of cinder block. His jaw muscles were working furiously, grinding back and forth with a slow, agonizing rhythm, as if he were masticating invisible, heavy grit. He seemed entirely unaware of Eli's presence. Eli's focus on the human side of the operation led him to a morbid discovery in the dustier recesses of the main office archive. Behind a binder of outdated safety regulations, he found the complete personnel log for Sector 7. The list spanned 30 years. He found the column detailing his predecessors, the night shift feeders. Their names were neatly listed, then crossed out with dense, deliberate strokes of heavy black ink. The dates of their departure clustered tightly around the calendar's cycles of the new moon. The cause of separation, scrawled in the margin in a hasty, panicked hand, was the same for nearly every entry: assimilation. The word punched the breath out of Eli. It implied a blending, a consumption of identity. Eli realized the turnover rate was not a matter of poor working conditions. It was a scheduled event, a horrifying crop rotation. The horror that should have sent him running instead settled into a cold, paralyzing clarity. He felt his own body responding to the atmosphere, aligning with the slow, inevitable reality of Sector 7. His palms, constantly gripping the cold metal of the cart and the rough texture of the concrete walls, were calloused and dense, the skin losing sensitivity. His vision, too, had taken on a terrifying, hyper-focused edge. He saw every individual particle of dust hanging in the fluorescent light beams, every minute flaw in the structural integrity of the concrete. He saw the world with the stark, unflinching detail of a newly awakened insect. Fear, the hot, panicked terror that drove fight or flight, was fading. It was being replaced by a strange, hypnotic acceptance, an almost spiritual awe. The horror was simply a different form of intense respect for a power far exceeding his own. He was transitioning from prey to acolyte. Then came the voice. It happened late one night, just as Eli was drifting into a shallow, fitful sleep, suspended between the drone of the generator and the silent pressure of the forest. The voice did not come through his ears. It originated as a deep, resonant vibration in the bones of his skull. It was a low, humming chord, like the immense, sustained drone of high-voltage power lines stretched taut across a frozen valley. The voice was vast, ancient, and utterly devoid of gender or emotion. It was simply the sound of structure communicating. "They are preparing for you a new skin," the vibration articulated inside Eli's head, resonating deep in his molars. Eli sat bolt upright in the darkness. He felt no cold sweat, no sudden panic, just the recognition of truth. The realization hit him with the weight of a collapsed building. His routine, his utility, his entire purpose here was nearing its conclusion. He was not a permanent fixture. He was a meal replacement package stored for future consumption. The role of the feeder was about to end, and the role of the fed was about to begin. The bone fragments under his pillow felt suddenly heavier, warmer, like pieces of a destiny already cast. The call came at 10 o'clock ante-meridium, delivered by Greg, who stood in the doorway rigid as a scarecrow, his new, wiry beard catching the light. "Glenn wants to see you. Now. Office." Eli felt no surprise. He had been waiting for the summons. He walked down the corridor toward the administrative wing. The constant thrum of the generator seemed to increase in volume, sounding less like a background noise and more like a warning bell. Glenn's office had undergone a silent, sinister remodeling. The small windows, which once overlooked the parking area, were crudely boarded up with scrap lumber, transforming the room into a hermetically sealed box. The air was stale and thick. The only light came from a single, low-wattage desk lamp with a metallic green shade, casting an intense, oppressive circle of weak light onto Glenn's clutter-strewn desk. Glenn sat behind the desk, looking more exhausted than usual, his face a roadmap of fine, desperate lines. He wore his uniform shirt, slightly too tight across the shoulders. His hand nervously worked his heavy ring of keys, shaking them in a small, dry rattle that was irritating and high-pitched. They sat in the suffocating silence for what felt like 10 minutes. Glenn was not looking at Eli's collarbone this time. He was looking at his hands, watching the slight tremor as he agitated the keys. "You've settled in well, Eli," Glenn finally said, his voice quiet, flat, and carrying a strange, low register of profound envy. "Too well. You've been observant. You've been paying attention to the silence." Eli did not respond. He focused instead on the biological horror playing out beneath the crisp collar of Glenn's uniform shirt. Just above the fabric, where Glenn's carotid pulse should have been, Eli saw movement. A visible bulge, long and sinuous, pulsed slowly under the skin of Glenn's neck. It traveled in short, deliberate strokes, moving beneath the thin layer of flesh like a thick, white larva migrating through tissue. The office setting, the paper clips, the dusty computer monitor, the plastic water cooler, created an unbearable contrast with the organic violation on the man's neck. The veneer of normalcy was peeling away like sun-blasted paint. Glenn seemed to notice Eli's gaze and reflexively shifted his tie to conceal the movement. He leaned forward, pushing a stack of manila folders aside. "The Dweller," Glenn began, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is not a prisoner in the traditional sense. It's an anchor, something that holds the rest of it back. Something that keeps the other side of the veil from pressing into this reality completely. But anchors require maintenance. They require energy." He did not say meat. He said energy, and anchors need fresh contact, a regular influx of new perception to remain stable. The meat is just a caloric smokescreen. The real necessity is the cycle of human attention and expectation. You figured that out, didn't you, Eli? You started giving it gifts. Glenn's face contorted into a brief, painful grimace of acknowledgement. The anchor demands a constant exchange of shells to keep its equilibrium. People like me, Coleman, Gregg, we are too saturated, too brittle. We've been assimilated into the maintenance protocol. We are just the wiring now. You are still soft, freshly milled. He reached across the desk and picked up a canister the size of a fire extinguisher, painted a sterile white with black lettering, high-grade biocide. The Dweller's chamber requires a complete chemical scrub. We estimate the buildup of organic matter is compromising the integrity of the containment structure. A full disinfection. This means you will go in. You will spray the entire area, floor to ceiling. You are the only one who hasn't been inside yet, Eli. It needs a clean slate. The command hung in the stale air. Eli understood immediately. The disinfection was a euphemism, a final act of service. He was not going in to clean the cell. He was going in to be consumed, to become the clean slate upon which the Dweller would start its next cycle of observation. His body was the next inevitable payment the anchor demanded. The realization brought a sharp, clarifying sense of finality. The last threads of hope had snapped. Eli felt a profound, almost luxurious acceptance. It was over. The game had concluded. "Midnight," Glenn said, pushing the canister across the desk. It felt cold and heavy in Eli's hands. "Coleman will be on watch. No mistakes. You understand the procedure?" "Yes," Eli said. His voice was steady. "You're a good worker, Eli. Careful. We appreciate your dedication." Glenn sounded like he was selling Eli a terrible, life-ending insurance policy. Eli returned to his cramped room. He placed the heavy biocidal canister by the door. He walked to the mirror in the tiny bathroom, lit by a single buzzing bulb. He stared at his own reflection. His eyes, usually a muddy brown, looked unnervingly bright and focused. He felt a profound sense of detachment. He brought out the collection of pearlescent bones from beneath his pillow. He lined them up on the writing table. They seemed to hum faintly in the weak light. They were no longer objects of fear, but parts of a map to a terrible geography. Midnight, the time for disinfection, the time for assimilation. Eli no longer feared the Dweller. He feared what the Dweller would find when it looked into his core. The emptiness, the lack of passion, the cold internal desert that had driven him to take a job in this miserable concrete box. He did not fear his elimination. He feared his inadequacy as a vessel. The minutes between 11:30 post-meridium and midnight stretched taut, vibrating like piano wire about to snap. The base was utterly still. The generator's thrum was the only indication that the mechanisms of the mundane were still functioning. Eli felt the cold weight of the heavy biocidal canister pressing into his thigh as he descended to B3. He was wearing his heavy work boots, thick denim, and his sense of painful clarity. Coleman stood guard by the confinement door, his face a mask of anxious anticipation. He did not speak, merely nodded once, his eyes wide and unfocused, already seeing things that were not present. The final sequence began. Coleman turned the massive locking wheels. They gave way with a protracted, grinding moan of stressed metal, a sound that seemed to travel far beyond the concrete walls. The seal broke. A puff of air rushed out, but it did not smell like caged animal. It was a complex, shocking aroma. Old, dry paper, like forgotten books in a vast library, sweet, desiccated flowers, and underneath it all, the cool, profound scent of deep, under-earth soil, undisturbed for millennia. The interior light of the chamber, a single harsh beam, was still on, but it failed to illuminate the full space. The door, a behemoth of steel, swung inward on hinges that sounded like a ritualistic sigh. Eli stepped across the threshold. The chamber was large, 40 feet by 30 feet. The concrete was deeply scored, stained with old, dark patches that looked less like blood and more like oxidized historical memory. And in the farthest corner, the Dweller waited. It was not a beast, not in any definition Eli had learned. It was a biological impossibility, an arrangement of form that defied conventional physics. It was a dense, shifting congregation of pale, muscleless limbs, joints, and tendons, a mountain of milky white, half-translucent flesh woven into an impossibly complex, living geometry. It was all angles and no body, a Gordian knot tied in wet, breathing cartilage. It had no traditional face, no head. Instead, where a face might have been, there was a dense, pulsating cluster, a kaleidoscope of eyes. They were not uniform. Some were small and glittering black. Others were huge, wet ovals, and still others were the many-faceted, polygonal pupils from the sketches in the notebook. and they were all fixed on Eli. As he stood there, frozen, the eyes began to shift and overlap. Eli's consciousness flooded, overwritten with vivid, non-sequential images. The neon sign of a long-shuttered diner he had driven past as a boy. The chipped ceramic of his mother's favorite coffee cup. The numbers on his last, unpaid electric bill. The eyes were reflecting, projecting, compiling every mundane personal memory Eli carried. The Dweller was not simply watching him, it was reading him, line by line. Eli found himself unable to move toward the center of the room. The biocidal canister suddenly feeling ridiculously heavy, a pathetic symbol of human control. Instead of lunging, the Dweller extended something toward him. It was not a limb designed for violence. It was a single, impossibly thin strand of its own flesh, almost transparent, stretching across the concrete floor like a glass filament drawn from a great, terrible furnace. Eli felt an overwhelming compulsion to obey. He knelt slowly, dropping the canister, which landed with a muffled thud. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the cool, slick surface of the living thread. Contact was instantaneous and shattering. Eli's mind exploded not with pain, but with data. He was suddenly seeing through 1,000,000 years of memory. He saw the primeval forest that covered this land, ancient black trees whose roots were thicker than modern buildings. He saw creatures, not mammals, not insects, who walked the earth and fed this entity with offerings of belief, not of flesh. The meat he had delivered was just a pale imitation of the true communion the Dweller had always received, the willing surrender of perception. He understood the profound arrogance of his employers. They saw the creature as an animal to be managed, a threat to be contained with steel and scheduled feeding. They believed they were the masters of the cage. But the Dweller was not a prisoner. It was a deity in a temporary chrysalis, accepting the meager offerings of meat, only to sustain the charade. The steel cage was not to keep it in. It was to keep them from seeing the truth. Eli stared into the shifting kaleidoscope of eyes, his sense of self eroding into a thin film. He realized that the feeding was not about sustenance. It was about proximity. It was about conditioning the Dweller to accept the presence of the human vessel for the final transformation. Glenn stood framed in the doorway, backed by Coleman, whose rifle was raised, aimed directly at Eli's chest. Glenn's face, usually waxy and emotionless, was alight with a sick, terrifying anticipation. "Enough of the theatrics, Eli," Glenn rasped. "It's time. You've had your moment of revelation. Now complete the cycle." Glenn raised his voice, a high, strained command that sliced through the pressurized air. "Anchor Protocol Initiate. Start the transformation." Eli understood what that meant. They had brought him here, softened him, integrated his fear and compliance, and now they were ready to complete the assimilation written in the archives. Eli was the catalyst for the Dweller's next stage and for the base's temporary, terrified security. The Dweller responded to Glenn's command. The living geometry in the corner began to unfold. It was not a fluid motion, but a series of agonizing, loud dislocations. Its hidden joints cracked like dry branches snapping in a winter storm, the sound amplified tenfold in the concrete chamber. The milky white skin stretched taut, glistening, revealing thick, pulsing blue veins that ran like electrical wires just beneath the surface. It was moving from passive meditation to active expansion. The kaleidoscope of eyes, now intensely focused, settled on Eli. But the question was not about violence. It was the same silent query. Will you become the key that frees me, or just another part of the cage? Eli glanced toward the far corner, past the dweller. There, piled high, was the meat he had delivered night after night. It was not rotting, nor was it consumed. The huge slabs of beef were compacted, fused together into a massive, pulsating wall of pink and yellow tissue. It was a construction project, a living, throbbing foundation from which the dweller was erecting something else entirely, a biological bulwark. The horrific truth crystallized. Glenn, Coleman, and Greg were not guardians serving a necessary purpose. They were parasites, feeding the dweller just enough to keep it tethered, hoping to steal some sliver of its cosmic permanence by controlling its environment and feeding it human sacrifice under the guise of protocol. They were not protecting the world. They were running a vile, self-serving experiment on a caged god. A surge of white-hot, righteous rage, the first truly human emotion Eli had felt in days, washed over him. It was a fierce, protective instinct, not for his own life, but for the purity of the horror he had just encountered. "You're wrong!" Eli screamed, his voice cracking against the immense walls. He seized the heavy biocidal canister he had dropped. It was bulky and heavy, still filled with chemical fluid. With a primal, desperate effort, he hurled it like a lead baseball, aiming directly at Glenn's face. The canister struck Glenn with a sickening, wet impact, the steel edge connecting sharply with the bridge of his nose. The cheap tin fractured. Glenn stumbled backward, raising his hands, but the skin where the canister hit did not bleed red. Instead, a thick, gray, muddy ichor like watered-down cement sprayed across Coleman's uniform. Glenn cried out, a sound less of pain and more of mechanical malfunction, his waxen face dissolving where the fluid had struck. Chaos exploded. The sound of the struggling men, the spray of caustic fluid, and the unexpected disruption ripped the fragile silence of the base to shreds. A siren, buried deep in the facility's warning system, began to wail, a stuttering, pathetic shriek that was immediately drowned out by a sound that came not from the base but from the earth itself, a deep, profound, subterranean roar, the sound of the world rearranging its interior. The dweller moved. It was not a run or a walk. It was a liquid slide, a translation of mass. It covered the distance from the corner to the entrance in a single nonlinear burst, defying the laws of velocity and inertia. Coleman fired his rifle, a sharp, deafening crack, but the round struck the concrete above the creature, sending a puff of pulverized dust into the air. The transformation was tearing the building apart. The concrete walls of the chamber began to split, not along the seams of the poured slabs, but randomly, forming fissures a foot wide. Through the cracks, Eli saw not steel rebar, but the thick, pulsating, rope-like roots of giant black living trees, older than recorded history, pushing their way into the chamber. Eli scrambled backward, shielding his eyes from the falling debris. He heard Coleman scream, not in fear, but in pure, tearing disbelief, as the dweller's complex anatomy consumed the light in the hallway. The cage was broken. The anchor was free to weigh down the rest of the world. The electricity failed instantly, not with a flicker, but with a total annihilating pop that plunged Sector 7 into a darkness so profound it felt like a geological feature. It was a primordial night, unblemished by starlight or moon. Eli was thrown backward by the concussion of the breaking concrete, landing hard amidst a pile of shattered debris. The metallic chaos of the gunshots had given way to wet, tearing noises, punctuated by the high, hopeless shrieks of the men. He crawled blindly, dragging himself across the floor of the hallway. He felt under his hands a warm, slick fluid that was not water, mixed with the sharp shards of broken masonry. The smells of copper and antiseptic were now overwhelmed by the fierce, hot stench of ruptured viscera and the acrid smoke of frying electrical systems. The overwhelming darkness had gifted Eli a new sense. He could not see with his eyes, but he perceived in the dark. It was a sense that registered thermal changes, movement, and, most terrifyingly, the pure, undiluted heat signature of absolute fear. He saw Glenn. The manager was staggering away, a ghost in the darkness, his motion slow and desperate, like someone moving through thick, unseen syrup. The gray fluid that had sprayed from his face after the impact had sealed the skin, giving his face the appearance of cracked, dried mud. The dweller reached Glenn. It did not rush. Its complex, fluid shape simply flowed around the corner, covering the distance with impossible speed. The final sound Glenn made was a choked, gurgling gasp of understanding. It was an absorption. Eli watched in his new thermal sight as Glenn's frantic heat signature merged instantly with the larger, colder mass of the dweller, becoming indistinguishable, merely a small infusion of warmth into an infinite cold. Eli scrambled through a gaping hole where the main structural wall used to be, propelled by a will he did not recognize as his own. He was out of the primary structure, stumbling onto what had been the loading dock. The forest was active, malevolent. The trees surrounding the base had surged skyward, their trunks thicker, their branches tightly interwoven, forming a massive black vault overhead that blocked any sight of the true night sky. The ground beneath Eli's heavy boots was soft, breathing, shifting with a slow, visceral pulse. He heard another noise, muffled but close. Greg. No, please God, no. I cleaned the chute. I logged everything. I followed the procedure. The plea was choked, dissolving into the chaotic sounds of the fracturing building. Eli heard a final sharp thwack, the sound of something large and dense striking yielding tissue, followed by the silence. Assimilation complete. As Eli ran blindly toward what he knew was the perimeter road, the air around him illuminated. The heavy, moist atmosphere was now laced with fine, microscopic particles that floated and drifted, giving off a dim, sickly, phosphorescent glow like toxic plankton. These were spores. They clung to his denim, to his exposed skin, and he inhaled them deeply with every ragged breath. Inside his chest, Eli felt a strange, expanding sensation, not pain, but a sudden, limitless widening of his lung capacity, a cold, empty echo chamber opening within his ribs. He felt no cold, no exhaustion, only a terrible, terrifying sense of unity with the surrounding horror. He dared to look back at the main structure of Sector 7. The entire hangar block was under immense internal pressure. The concrete shell did not collapse. It burst open. Thick, white cables of muscle and tendon, the color of clean bone marrow, shot out from the cracks and fractured window slits, stretching violently upward toward the unseen moon. The whole structure looked like a colossal, pale chrysalis, shedding its final, inadequate skin. The dweller was no longer contained. It was emerging, and it was building. Eli stumbled out onto the cracked asphalt of the old access road. He was covered in filth and the glowing spores, his humanity shedding like old flakes of paint. He knew the creature, The anchor was gone, moving into the deeper woods to begin its slow cosmic work. He was the last one standing, having survived the night of broken iron, but the silence he carried within him was louder than the generator's scream. He was not saved, he was deployed. Dawn arrived hesitantly, struggling to penetrate the thick, humid fog that had settled over the devastation. The mist was heavy and corrosive, smelling intensely of burned materials, damp earth, and that lingering, sweet metallic tang of spilled expectation. Eli sat on the uneven edge of a massive piece of foundation concrete, catching his breath. His clothes were shredded, soaked through, and plastered to his skin. He was covered not only in mud and gore, but also in the faint, silvery residue left by the microscopic spores, thin metallic lines tracing the veins on the back of his hands and scoring his neck. The adrenaline had ebbed, leaving behind a cold, unnerving calm. Eli felt no pain, only a deep-seated, profound vigilance. He surveyed the ruins. The main facility was gone, reduced to a sprawling mound of shattered concrete and twisted, exposed rebar. A sickening quiet had returned. This was the satisfied silence of the hunt completed, the predator resting after its massive meal. Then, he saw movement among the ruins. It was not the dweller. The anchor had moved on. This was the salvage crew. Coleman emerged first, crawling out from under a collapsed service vehicle. He was not the granite-faced man Eli remembered. His movements were jerky, insectile, his joints locking and unlocking with unnatural speed. His face was stretched, the skin tight across his cheekbones. His jaw had elongated, his mouth now a narrow, predatory opening. His teeth were too long, too pointed, crowding his gums like a set of polished, terrible needles. A few minutes later, two other men, low-level maintenance workers Eli barely knew, Josh and Edgar, climbed out of a drainage ditch. They were similarly transformed. Their clothing hung in tatters, and their hands were pressed to the ground, their long, spidery fingers already sprouting strange, rigid hairs. Their eyes were vacant, fixed on the dense, altered forest where the dweller had retreated. They were not functioning humans. They were echoes, the shells that Glenn had spoken of, now horribly renewed. They were assimilated. Eli looked at them, and they looked back at him. There was no recognition of shared humanity, only the silent, chilling acknowledgement of a shared, terrible baptism. They did not appear distressed or frightened. They simply seemed tuned, calibrated to a new, singular frequency. Eli understood the final horrifying truth. The dweller was never the only entity. It was the originator, the focus, the massive generating seed. Everyone who had worked here, everyone who had handled the meat, everyone who had breathed the spore-laced, copper-smelling air, carried a microscopic biological piece of the anchor inside them. The contact, the ritual, the expectation. It was not about feeding the creature outside the cage. It was about priming the parasite within the host. Every slab of meat Eli had delivered, every piece of bone he had accepted, had been an act of communion. He had participated in a prolonged, deliberate sacrament, preparing his own body to become a suitable vessel for the new consciousness. He felt a sudden, thick warmth in his mouth. He spat and saw a thin streak of dark red fluid on the concrete. It was not his blood, not entirely. It was the memory of all that raw, steaming beef, now fully integrated into his physical being. Coleman shuffled closer, his gaze locked on the tree line. He raised one of his elongated hands. the fingers ending in black, razor-sharp nails, and gave a small, jerky nod. Eli nodded back. It was not a conversation. It was the silent, terrible understanding between packmates. They were a new species, built on the ruins of the old, bound together by the rhythm of the dwellers' massive, receding presence. Their purpose was not survival or flight. It was service. They were the harvest, the first fruits of the transformation, waiting for the command. Eli rose slowly, feeling the stiffness of his muscles give way to a disconcerting, effortless fluidity of movement. He felt taller, more coordinated, and profoundly, terrifyingly hungry, not for canned beans or meat, but for the satisfaction of the new directive thrumming deep in his core. The sun crested the horizon, a cold, indifferent sphere of bruised orange light that did little to dissipate the heavy chemical fog. Eli began walking. The perimeter road, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt leading toward the distant promise of civilization, was slick with dew and ash. He left the remnants of Sector 7 behind, the silence broken only by the faint, unsettling sounds of Coleman and the others beginning their meticulous, purpose-driven work among the ruins, not clearing the debris, but organizing it. Eli's gait was heavy, but his movements were economical, almost graceful. He moved with a relentless mechanical purpose that transcended mere human exhaustion. He knew without conscious thought that he was walking toward the nearest small town, about 7 miles away. The authorities would eventually find the ruined facility. They would find the remnants of the others, maybe even interview Coleman, who would offer a perfectly rehearsed account of an industrial accident or gas leak. Eli, however, would be found on the road, a survivor stumbling out of the wilderness, traumatized and desperate for help. He would be taken to a hospital, fed hot broth, wrapped in warm blankets, and asked easy, gentle questions. They would see a victim. They would never suspect the vector. Inside him, the dweller's essence, the silent echo of the anchor, was fully awake. It was not a voice in the traditional sense, but a series of cold, precise instructions, guiding his muscles, controlling his facial expressions, ensuring he maintained the facade of fragile humanity. He felt the creeping physical changes intensifying. The silver lines of the spores had sunk beneath the skin, leaving a fine, hard shell beneath the epidermis. His teeth were the worst. There was a relentless internal itching deep in his gums, a terrible pressure as his molars and incisors rearranged themselves, becoming denser, sharper, preparing to tear the paper-thin membrane between Eli and the world he was about to enter. He was the vanguard. He was the first wave of the dweller's necessary expansion. The meat of the human world was simply too large and too insulated to be taken all at once. It needed inoculation. Eli reached a bend in the road where the dense pine forest gave way to scattered farmland. The silence was still with him, but now it was portable, contained entirely within the rhythmic, unhurried motion of his body. He had left everything that defined him as a man back in the smoking ruins, his fear, his regret, the need to pay his overdue bills. He was now pure utility, a sharpened instrument of cosmic necessity. He stopped briefly beside a rusted, faded sign promising a gas station and a diner 3 miles ahead. He looked down at the asphalt. Under the pale morning light, his shadow stretched out, long and distorted. It was wrong. It was too long for his height. The limbs of the shadow unnaturally thin, with segments that moved fractionally later than his own movement. The shadow was casting an image of the thing he was becoming. Eli looked into the greasy, fly-specked window of an abandoned roadside cafe. The reflection staring back was undeniably his, the dirty flannel shirt, the gaunt face. But the eyes were utterly transformed. The pupils were gone, replaced entirely by the dense, crystalline pattern of the polyhedral eyes, complex, shimmering facets that absorbed the faint light and reflected it back with cold, analytical brilliance. He smiled. The expression felt alien on his face, a raw, painful stretch of muscle that was no longer geared toward human emotion. The smile was not one of relief or joy. It was the precise, anticipatory baring of teeth. The town lay just beyond the next rise, a cluster of rooftops, streetlights, and the promise of soft, warm, unsuspecting bodies. It seemed vast and quiet, a huge, defenseless pen filled with predictable, easy prey. The final cold awareness settled into Eli's core. The story of Sector 7 had ended with the collapse of the concrete. The next chapter would be written not in ink and regulation, but in the spilled plasma and shredded tissue of those who believed themselves to be the pinnacle of creation. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his gaze to mimic the dull vacancy of a deeply traumatized victim, and began walking toward the harvest. He was the inheritance of the moon, and the dawn was his accomplice.